Now that we have a background on password cracking, let's apply it to an online network service. Because there are many targets, network services are one of those types of targets. So why would we crack a password against the network service? Well, users log on to network services all the time. And they do it with these protocols. And the protocols, of course, we just kind of relate to the service using the protocol. So file and print SMB, a web server HTTP, an FTP server, a remote desktop, Telnet, SSH, LDAP, the emails, SQL. There are even more than this. People connect to these services remotely and they log in. And very often, the same usernames and passwords for these services are just in the operating system. You could use them just to log in right at the operating system. So network services very often use the very same credentials. In fact, they just use the credentials that are stored in the OS. This is especially true with services that are integrated into the OS as opposed to like third-party applications. Because once we crack a user's login for one of these services, one of these protocols, then we could just use that and log straight into the OS. Or we could use it against other network services. Now, not all network services use the operating system to store their credentials, or rather, I should say, use the user credentials from the OS, but a vast majority of them do. So here's just a really simple example. You could write your own login script to try to automate login to a Microsoft file and print server. In other words, Microsoft machine across the network. You could create a text file with possible credentials, possible usernames and passwords. And in this text file, this is like the content of the text file. You have the administrator and then the possible password. And this administrator is simply the username. So you could say administrator and the first password is nothing. Double quote, with no space. Or administrator and the password is password, spelled like this. And then the next one is, it's spelled like this. The next one is spelled like this. And you go down the list, and maybe the next password is just admin. You're just guessing. You're creating user and password pairs in a single text file that you hope is going to include the password. You make this long enough so that hopefully one of them is it. Then how do you use it? Well, you can just write a simple for loop, and this is a little tiny bit of programming 101, and it will do it for you. The trick of any of this is to just automate it. I mean, the whole thing that makes password cracking easy, or, well, maybe not easy, but the least amount of work, is that you have tools that do it for you. You have to provide the usernames and the possible passwords up front, but let them do the work. So here's a for loop. And the idea of a for loop is every programming language has the idea of a for loop. With a for loop, you're basically saying, for as long as a condition is true, do something. Okay, that's what a for loop is. And what we're basically saying here is we're declaring some things, item 1 and item 2, which are basically the username. So item 1 and item 2. So this %i is possible passwords, and rather possible usernames, and %j, these are just holders. These are just variables, placeholders. So for possible usernames, %i, possible passwords, %j. And we're going to, of course, we already had a list that we're going to use. And so you're just declaring these things, and you're saying, in this file, credentials.txt, that we created back here, using that file, do a command. And then this is the old command in Microsoft, the old DOS command to make a connection to a share. And so // target. Target is just the IP address or resolvable name of the server you're hitting. IPC $ is a process share that's there on every Microsoft machine. It's not a folder or anything, but you can log into it to, machines log into each other this way to trade browse lists and to trade, just to do things like work together on a process across the network. So you could say, do this command, net use whack whack target whack IPC dollar. In other words, try to connect to this process share. And use as a username whatever this variable is that we created here. Now this victim.com is just simply the domain, like example.com or microsoft.com /user, because in Microsoft what they do is you can have the same user, like you can have Betty appear in many different domains. So you say, well, what domain does she belong to? This is Microsoft.com Betty, as opposed to Cisco.com Betty, as opposed to easycouncil.org Betty, okay? So you're just basically saying, go through the list of users, and then we're going to capture, that's what we're going to capture, that's what these double greater than signs are, into a text file called outfile.txt. We're going to also put into it the time and the date. So these are just little variables from Microsoft. Just grab the system time and the system date. And we're going to also put in the victim target account, which was administrator, and password. And all this gets captured into this text file called outfile.txt. And the for loop is, do this as long as you have something you can go through in here in credentials.txt. When we hit the bottom, that's when the for condition ends, and that's when you stop. And the end result is to capture everything to this output file. So you just come back later and see if there was a finding. If there wasn't a finding, well, okay, that's fine. But if it will get a bigger dictionary. So that would just be a simple automated login script against the server service, the file and print server service, using SMB against the Windows machine. Although, quite frankly, any Linux machine running Samba, you can do this against them as well. Now, you might have some cases where it's just not practical to try to crack a password. So you can use something called pass the hash. When you create usernames in Windows, all those usernames and passwords are loaded up into memory because they come from the registry. They're in the SAM file. They're loaded up into memory where they can be used quickly. That stuff that's up in memory can be dumped. And so you can maybe have an exploit already. You want to dump all the password hashes because you want to try to crack people's passwords. I mean, yes, you've already compromised the box, but you want to have people's passwords for later. And you don't want to have to keep running this exploit. So you dump all the hashes. Now, these hashes, you can send them to pretty much any password cracker, but some of them might just be too long or too complex to crack in a reasonable amount of time. So what you do is you use a special tool. There are pass the hash type tools. Metasploit has them, and others have them. When you make a connection, instead of providing a username and a normal password, you provide the username and the hash equivalent, and you log in that way. That's called pass the hash. So pass the hash, it's a network-based attack. We steal hashed user credentials. We use those hashes to authenticate to the same network or the same service, the same device, the same system that created the hashes to begin with. The hash dumps will come from memory, the Windows registry, or other credentials files. Metasploit has post modules that are really good to do pass the hash against these kinds of targets. There are additional tools to manipulate hash dumps. Hydra, Medusa, Veil Catapult, so you can use those as well. It might not always work. If the latest versions of Windows are running Windows Defender Credential Guard, or they have registry settings for user account control, pass the hash might not work. But it is possible, if you get deeper into it, to turn these services off. It's possible. We have a term called network authentication brute force. Now, I said before that a brute force is when the dictionary runs out, you just try letters and numbers and combinations till you get it. There's a different sort of common usage of the term brute force in terms of network authentication. When we're talking about brute forcing a network service as opposed to brute forcing a password file. We're talking about a high-speed, intensive dictionary attack against that network service. And again, like I said, many services don't have their own list of usernames and passwords. They just simply use operating system accounts for their users. So you target a user account that can't be locked out, like administrator or root, and you target a service that listens on whatever protocol, and you do a high-speed, multi-threaded, meaning multiple processes working at the same time, dictionary attack against that thing. Loads of tools you can use to network brute force. Hydra, Medusa, Encrack, NetBIOS auditing tool, A2 Brutus, AirCrack, John the Ripper, Rainbow Crack, Kane Enable, Loft, Off, Hashcat, many Metasploit modules. So that is password cracking against a network service.